Good afternoon and warm welcome to this webinar that will highlight the complex and uncertain US trade landscape we have today. The webinar will be led by me, Helena Karlström Siegel, and I'm working in the Trade and Invest Facilitation at the headquarters in Stockholm. And with me, I have our colleagues, Johan Karlberg from our office in New York, and also Jacob Ailey from our office in Chicago. We will try to navigate those of you that are listening in today based on what we currently know in the subject. These are the topics that we will go through in today's webinar. A little bit practical before we start, and about this webinar, your camera and microphone will be turned off. We will have the Q&A function open, so you are welcome to ask your question in the chat. This webinar will be recorded, and it will be available to listen to afterwards. And a little bit about Business Sweden before we start the topics for today. Business Sweden, we help Swedish companies grow global sales and international companies invest and expand in Sweden. We are a global organization with 54 offices and locations around the world. In Sweden, we operate from the headquarters in Stockholm and through our representation in 20 locations in Sweden. We are jointly owned by the state and the business sector. And Johan and Jacob, will you please present yourself a little bit?
Absolutely. Thank you, Helena. My name is Johan Karlberg. I'm part of the Business Sweden organization here in the US. I'm based out of New York City. I joined 2 years ago. Prior to that, I had 27 years in the private sector working as a management consultant with Accenture and Roland Berger all over the world, including a couple of years here in the States, 4 years in China, and across Europe. The Business Sweden setup here in the US is about 50 people. We're based out of offices in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., where we take on both of the tasks that Helena mentioned, both the helping Swedish businesses in the US, as well as trying to attract US investors into Sweden. So with that, Jacob, please.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Jacob Ailey. I'm based in our Chicago office. I'm a consultant here, and my background is primarily, prior to Business Sweden was with policy analysis, especially in monetary policy and trade policy. And I've been supporting Johan here with our analysis of the tariffs and the impacts of the Trump 2.0 administration on Swedish businesses, and happy to kind of field questions and support in the dialogue today. And hopefully we can find ways to add value and help you navigate these uncertain times.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Good to have you with me in today's webinar. I also want to present the team that I'm working in, the Business Sweden Trade and Invest Facilitation team, where we are 9 persons with the competence and expertise in topics such as delivery terms, free trade agreement, customs procedures, and etc. My team is helping Swedish companies in their export technical questions. We hold open training courses, and we also customize training program for companies that want our help. So that was shortly about the organization that are hosting this webinar today. To start, I would like to talk about the classification for the product. The companies need to understand what the current classification for the product will be, as the classification determines how much duty and other taxes will be are payable on imports. The classifications also tells if the product may have specific regulations or restriction that must be followed to avoid complications such as it can be stopped at the border. So if you look into the structure, we have the 2 digits level, it's the chapter level. Then we have the 4 digit number, it's the HS number, and it's where the free trade agreements are set, the rules in the free trade agreements are set. HS subheading is the 6 digit level and are international. That means that it's the same classification worldwide. And the combined nomenclature, CN, is the EU's 8-digit code system consisting of the number of the harmonized system HS with additional EU subdivisions. And it's on the 8 level we are using when we are exporting out from EU. The 10-digit number is the one where it will be different depending on which country you are importing in, because each country decides themselves how deep they want to classify. So that will be a difference. So if we put all this into an example, we can see that the classification is different in this example already at the 8-digit level. This product is in chapter 94, it's a furniture. And the specific example is a metal furniture of a kind very used in office. And this product code is an example of the product that from March 12th included in the additional duties of 25% when importing into the US. So according to the new landscape, this means that to be able to import the equipment in a proper way, it is needed to be specified how much of aluminium is included in the product. It must be shown in kilogram and value. Otherwise, the entire declared value of the product will be subject to additional duty of 25% plus the residual duty, if any, for the product. So for your companies that are listening to us today, how and where can you search and see the classification for your product and what duty will apply? Firstly, I think you should look into the Swedish tulltaxan, and if you are unsure what is the most suitable classification, you can turn to the Swedish Customs, Tullverket, to get assistance. Secondly, to understand how your product will be classified in US, you can use the US HTS database, and it could be a good idea to get support from your customer, or perhaps if you have a customs broker in the US, as it can be a little bit tricky with the classification. And unfortunately, I have seen that the US HTS database isn't updated with, for the moment at least, with the current tariff. So for the thirdly, I recommend that you check in the EU's database access to markets, as they have updated and they have inserted another box tick. You can see I have a red box for the marking it on the screen, and they call it UCD, Universal Customs Duty Rate, also called reciprocal, when you are searching on your product for export to US. I also want to give you a reminder to look into the non-preferential origin of your product, as it determines where the product comes from when it arrives to the US Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and it's their rules to consider when importing into the US. So I will turn to Jacob or Johan. Who wants to proceed?
Let me start, and Helena, maybe tacking on to what you're saying. It's important to remember that what's going on right now with trade here in the US is very similar to what's been going on for the last 20 years. There are many things that are things we've seen before in terms of trying to build barriers, but not participating in World Trade Organization efforts. For example, the current administration is the third administration that has not put in place judges into WTO, meaning that the WTO is pretty much toothless right now. What is different, though, is the way that things are being done. Historically, tariffs have been done through law and legislation, and in that case, it's usually a 6 to 12-month process where both US government departments and trade partners get a chance to speak and come with suggestions and details. That's not happening right now. That also means that the speed at which things are changing is much higher. And that also means that the departments in charge of enforcing these tariffs are not always up to speed on what's going on. As example given, Helena, by the fact that the HTS code tables aren't fully up to date yet. And in the same way, the departments need to decide how to interpret some of the executive orders, as the executive orders are not as detailed as the legislation typically is. So we're seeing a lot of things that are similar in fashion, but different in form. So the trajectory is the same. The US is seeking bilateral or multilateral engagement and not necessarily world free trade.
Yeah.
That said, the US business is huge for Swedish companies. It is about 10% of the export from Sweden, but it's 3 times as large the turnover of Swedish companies in the US. So for many of the big companies, they already have supply chains that are local and may not be as affected. But it's important to remember that the US market is very significant for Swedish companies. And I think with that, Helena, let's move to the next page.
Yes.
So here's some of that exemplified by the trade interventions and the rising number of trade intervention over time. You'll see that to the left. It's also interesting that the number of interventions deal mainly with the big trading partners, and you'll see that in the middle, China, Mexico, and Canada. And of course, then comes the number of EU countries. Those are the 4 major trading partners to the US right now. Mexico being the single largest, has replaced China as the major trading partner over the last couple of years. Canada also growing in importance, making a regional setup with US, Canada, and Mexico under the free trade agreement, USMCA, which replaced the prior North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, during Trump's first presidency. So Trump 1.0 is highly responsible for any of the setups with Mexico and Canada that the current administration is criticizing. So it's very likely that we'll see new negotiations. They're planned for 2026 around the rules of the free trade agreement, USMCA. But it's still likely that that remains a strong trade union with significant areas of free trade or very preferential tariffs going forward.
Sweden is a small part down there, 2%.
Correct. So I think
Okay.
we're moving on.
Next slide. Yes.
Yes, please. Jacob, you want to do this?
Yeah, I can take this one. So yeah, what we want to highlight here is that, you know, beginning in Trump era one, we saw this kind of first phase of shifting away from China. So you can see some of the leading trade partners and the mix of manufactured goods being imported into the U.S. So we see a stark decrease in China's imports into the U.S. of these manufactured goods. And then there's these other 13 Asian low-cost countries and regions that start to increase. So that makes a lot of sense, right? We're seeing shifts of these imports from China to other countries such as Vietnam, India, Southeast Asia. But now we're starting to see a second trend emerge. You know, we saw from between 2022 and 2023 that there was a decrease in these Southeast Asian countries being their imports of manufactured goods into the U.S. And then we saw an increase in Canada and Mexico, as well as Europe, just a bit more of a minor increase. But we are starting to see the second trend now of regionalization. So, you know, while we're seeing these actions from the Trump administration, we just want to contextualize this, that, you know, they are very chaotic in the nature they're being implemented, perhaps, but the trend is still there. We're not going to see this go away entirely. You know, we are going to see these supply chains become more regional globally, but especially in the U.S., we're seeing that push towards that. And even the Biden administration was not escaping that trend as well. They kept into place a lot of those tariffs from Trump 1.0 and a lot of the policies around trade, while they had maybe more room for exemptions, you know, than Trump had initially planned. They did still keep them implemented. So that's just kind of highlighting this trend that there is shifts within the whole global system of trade at this moment. You know, that's just what I wanted to highlight here. But you know, maybe we can go to the next slide then.
This is a very busy page, so we'll walk you through it fairly slowly. But this sort of captures what we see right now in one place. On the left, you'll see a number of countries and categories, and on the right, we have some exemptions from those. Starting with China. China is today, with the current administration, seen as the #1 global adversary. And that's not only in trade. That goes for IP, for military, etc. With that, there is no willingness to ship US consumer spending to Chinese companies and the Chinese government. So there is a very clear direction of trying to isolate China and trying to limit the trade between the US and China. And that's seen in the way that the administration has been put together, with some very clear China hawks, such as Peter Navarro, Howard Lutnick, and Marco Rubio. Navarro, for example, wrote the book Death by China, and has been very outspoken on his views on Chinese trade. That is now escalated to a point where there is 145% tariffs on Chinese goods. China followed in suit up to 125% and then started with other measures, for example, limiting the amount of rare earth minerals it exports to the US. So it's unlikely that we'll see something continue at the level of 145%, but some kind of limited trade is likely to come out of this. And then there are some exceptions. For example, electronics have been exempt into the US, but the de minimis used for e-commerce specifically, it's a 100-year-old rule that shipments below $800 are exempt. That rule is going away in a couple of weeks, severely impacting low-cost Chinese goods for e-commerce.
A question. Sorry,
of course. Of course.
We are talking about China and the 145%. I saw something about that Mr. Trump perhaps are thinking over that it could be lower, or
Just yesterday in a press conference, President Trump basically held out a hand for negotiations.
Yeah.
It's unclear what that will lead to in the short term, but it's been seen here as a loss of face for Trump, that he felt the need to extend that hand, and that China is not coming to the table on their own. So for now, I think the ball has been played to President Xi, and we'll see what happens.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
We then come to the local partners, Canada and Mexico, where this is a different kind of logic. If China is an idea of isolation, for Canada and Mexico, it's unlikely that the US consumers can withstand the high 25% tariffs that are currently placed on non-USMCA goods. But there are other things that the Trump administration wants from Canada and Mexico. And it deals with local policy, for example, immigration policies. It cites the drug trade across the border, but it definitely also has trade implications, because currently, for example, Mexico has a free trade agreement with China. So a lot of Chinese goods make their way into Mexico, are then converted into a finished good, and then under USMCA being traded into the US with no tariffs at all. So that sort of backdoor for Chinese goods is something that the Trump administration is looking to close, and that was very clear during the presidential election process this fall, that Trump was keenly aware of it and mentioned it on several occasions, that back door was something he wanted to close. But of course, it's not up to the US to do on their own, because Mexico is a sovereign nation and needs to be able to dictate their own trade. So we'll see where that takes us. But for now, there is 25% tariffs on about half of Mexican imports, anything that is not under the free trade agreement USMCA.
Yeah.
With the European Union, this is again a different process, and some of you may have heard Trump talk about the reciprocal tariffs that came into effect April 5th. The logic was for a 10% base tariff on anybody, on all countries, and then April 9th there was an additional tariff that was unique by trading partner. So for the EU, that was 20%. And the way that reciprocity was calculated was basically the trade deficit. So in the case of EU, close to 40%, and then that was divided in two, making it 20%, and that was the tariff that was assigned to the EU. And the same way with a long list of countries. Few days after that was put in place, it was paused, mainly due to the fact that the stock market crashed, the bonds market increased the interest rates significantly on US bonds. So there was a need for the administration to walk that back, and that was done in a 90-day pause. The current situation on that is that Japan and Korea seem to be the countries that are first out to negotiate with the Trump administration, and we're keenly following what that will end up in. But it is unlikely that the administration will be able to do 75 to 80 deals in the coming 80 days, which is what's needed to fully eliminate the reciprocal tariffs.
It will be tough, I assume.
Unlikely. Then we have a few sectors that are being defended. Steel and aluminum, for example, automotive. There is now also some early announcement that the pharmaceuticals are being looked into, as well as semiconductors. But for now, we have steel and aluminum and automotive as actual tariffs in place. On steel and aluminum, there was a tariff of 10% that the Trump administration put in place last time. However, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration gave a number of exemptions. So what was done in March was to take away all exemptions and increase the tariff from 10 to 25% in order to protect US steel and aluminum industry here. The second is automotive, and that goes for any cars or light trucks. It's a 25% tariff. It is active. Automotive parts are being phased in and should be done fully no later than next week, May 3rd. So this is all in order to protect certain industries. And I think that's a good way to think about what's going on. It's either actual tariffs, and those are either punitive, like for China, or they're protective, like for steel and aluminum. And there are, on the other hand, the threat of tariffs, such as for Canada and Mexico, where it's not necessarily the trade itself that's the key thing that the administration is after, but other concessions. So actual tariffs and threat of tariffs is a way to think about this. So with that, Jacob, please feel free to add anything that I missed or misspoke.
No, it sounds good, but I do want to encourage people to use the Q&A function. I believe it's on the top right of your screen. Please submit some questions. As we come to the end here, we'll take some of those and field some of those questions. We recommend that you keep it to, impacts on business. We are staying away from speculating on the political side of the impacts. So, just due to the nature of our role. But I encourage you to use that function, and we'll field those at the end. But yeah, that's all. I think I'll also just add, for the reciprocal tariffs, there are a slew of exempt products. So we have some of those categories here towards the middle of the slide. We have hyperlinked within this slide the Annex 2 document that actually gives the HTS codes that are exempt from those tariffs. And so you can actually go in and look and see if your products are being exempted from that. Right now it's that 10%, but come the 90-day pause, it will be then that 20% on the EU. So definitely take a look at that. And then if you're importing from other countries, you can actually check what that percentage will be. Let's say you're importing from somewhere in Southeast Asia, you can look at the Annex 1 country list to see what that percentage will be aside from the EU. So that's all I'll add for this slide. But yeah, I see some questions are coming in. That's great. Again, we'll take those towards the end for now, and we'll come back to that. But thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jacob, that you are checking in our incoming questions. Any more on this slide, or do you want me to go further?
Let's move to the next one. And Jacob, you want to take that?
Yeah.
Yep. And so this just gives a little bit of a deeper dive into the steel and aluminum tariffs. So, we already kind of highlighted this, so I won't spend too much time. But the left side here says, how are these different? Again, increase from 10% to 25%. There's likely no possibility for exemptions, none at this moment. Additional steel and aluminum derivative products were also included. I've hyperlinked the list to those HTS codes that were then added, as Helena kind of highlighted in her example earlier. There was the new products in Chapter 94, like metal furniture. So, then what does it apply to? I've kind of listed what are the new categories. So Chapter 84, Chapter 85, and Chapter 94 were all added to these, not entirely, but some products from them that have steel and aluminum. And then, as Helena also highlighted, it's the content of aluminum and steel within that product. So, you need to have the weight or, some way to calculate that content to that, and you're tariffed on that content. So if you have other, non-steel or aluminum, that's not tariffed under that, the tariff doesn't apply to that percentage within that. And then a kind of derivative question of this, do the country reciprocal tariffs stack? Yes, but not always. So the new reciprocal tariff, so like that 10% base, is additive on the original or regular duties that were already existing prior. So that's typically the anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties. The Chinese tariffs did stack. So, we had that original 20%, and then Trump came out in the reciprocal tariffs and said there'd be an additional 34%. We saw that number shoot up, and so we're not actually sure where that number is going to fall right now. It's technically at 145%. So again, we'll see where that actual Chinese tariff falls at the end of the day. But originally it was proposed with the 20% and then the 34%. But the EU tariffs, the automotive does not stack with the 10%. That's the sector ones are sector specific, so we don't see those stacking. As well as goods with, this is something good to know, if you have any US content in your product, if you have at least 20% US content, the tariffs only apply to the non-US value. So that's another good way to kind of minimize the impact of some of these tariffs. Anything you'd like to add here, Johan, before we kind of move on?
I think that's good.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I add a question then?
Yes.
How should the companies prove that it's only 20% US content and the rest 80% or whatever it is? What kind of how to show it in the documentation? Do you have any idea about that?
Not sure. I think the best person to speak to would probably be a customs broker, as they're often familiar with the paperwork that's needed.
Yeah.
But from my understanding, it's typically right the value of your inputs. You kind of list out. You should be doing this kind of practice within your own company, because it's good best practices to kind of list out all of your inputs and what you purchase from your suppliers, the value of those inputs, and then you calculate it based off of that value. So not your the value you're charging your customer, but instead looking at all your various inputs. And there are different ways to do that. So there's let's say you're working with government contracts like Build America, Buy America. They have very specific regulations on how do you consider something to be US valued or content and how it rolls up under that. But then the general methodology is a little bit different from that. So again, the best person to probably speak to is a customs broker, or Helena, if you have any resources you would like to plug as well that you find useful on that, feel free to share as well.
Yeah. Okay, for sure. I understand. I think it must be something in the documentation, the invoice you need to specify. I think, but for now we don't have the deeper information. Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, we can go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So we're coming towards the end of the presentation, and we'll open up for questions in a minute. But I think there's some things to say about the future. And I think regardless of how things play out, my expectation is that the rest of 2025 is going to be messy. This is not going to be easy or calm and collected. So on the EU side, it is complicated because the Trump administration asks for easier trade. Now, some of the trade remit sits with EU, and Ursula von der Leyen is, of course, the natural partner for that. But the US administration is also asking for changes to trade policies, VAT, certifications, etc., to make that easier for US companies to deal with EU. And all of those things sit at national level. So it's going to be a very messy negotiation if it moves outside of simply talking about tariffs. And that's what we're saying, that it's either a sort of a trade agreement with the administration and then lifting some of the executive orders, or an actual legislative process in the US with a longer term deal. But that's unlikely, given that the Congress, even though it's a Republican majority, many of the Republicans are not necessarily in favor of tariffs. So the negotiation will be tricky, to say the least. If we then look to longer terms, as I mentioned in the beginning, the US has a history over the last 20 years of trying to retain manufacturing jobs. doing that through policy and subsidies. The states the US states do the same thing with subsidies and with various kinds of packages to attract manufacturing, and that's not going to go away. So what we urge companies to do is to take a longer look at the trade and not necessarily get caught up in the current headlines, because this is not a sustainable situation. And that takes us to the right-hand side, where we're stay informed, go beyond the news, look at the actual executive orders if they impact you, so that you understand what is actually being said, because quite often the executive orders are well written, they are informative, they talk about the reasoning behind, and they talk about the intent. So that's one good source, for example. Of course, then understanding customs compliance, if you deal with the US, taking help with that, either through our trade and invest facilitation team, and Helena is an excellent contact in that case. Or if you want to talk more about strategy and what might come out of this, Jacob and myself are available, and we have a whole team here in the US that's available for that kind of discussions. What we would urge companies to do fairly quickly, if not already done, is do the scenario analysis. What happens if? How do I deal with escalating trade? How do I deal with other countries than China stopping some exports or imposing other tariffs? What does that mean? And that also means understanding what it means to your competitor. Because, for example, right now, you may be subject to 10% tariffs, but if your competitor has things coming out of China, they're right now at a significant disadvantage. So right now you have a temporary advantage, a competitive advantage that you may be able to exploit. So even though it's a messy situation, there might be opportunities both for tactical measures as well as more longer term strategic measures to build resilience in your supply chains. So I think with that, I'll end on that note. And I think Jacob and Helena, we have some questions that came in before the seminar, and I think a couple of questions that came in during the seminar. So back to you, Jacob, to help guide us through some of the Q&A.
So I see we have quite a few questions around the steel and aluminum. So can we back up maybe 2 slides, and I can answer those quite quickly. So generally some of the questions were, does the 20, no, sorry, the next one after this.
Okay, this one.
Oh, no, sorry,
No.
Other way.
Sorry. Sorry.
So there was, a question around the Chapter 94 being listed, or all light fixtures covered for the tariffs if they have aluminum. I see another question around, does the 25% tariff affect the aluminum material only or the complete product? And then I see, there was another question around, my product, we sell a product and there's the HTS code. Is it affected by this? So generally, I see you gave your HTS code. I'm not going to share that out publicly, but if those first 2 numbers of the HTS code, these chapter numbers correspond to those first 2 numbers, as Helena highlighted earlier on, so like 72. So if your first 2 numbers are in any of these chapters, then it's worth looking deeper into. If it's not in any of these chapters, it's very likely that you're affected by the steel and aluminum tariffs. However, Helena, our team, is great at helping you with, identify the right product classification, and she can help you further in detail. So I really recommend submitting questions around, finding the right classification, after this webinar. As far as calculating the impact, let's say you are in one of these chapters, you produce a lighting fixture in Chapter 94. It's only very specific HTS codes within these derivative products. So these new chapters that have been added, 84, 85, and 94. So it's very, very important to know your product classification so that you can see then if you're affected by these new additional products that have been added under this. That if you look in the left side here, the top box, this presidential proclamation I've hyperlinked, it leads to a whole list of these HTS codes that have been added under these new chapters. So you can go in and actually see the specific HTS codes. You are only tariffed on the value of steel and aluminum in these derivative products. So that's why Helena was saying it's very good to know in kilograms what steel and aluminum you have in that product, because you're only tariffed on that amount. If you have like plastic or some other, that's not tariffed unless you don't provide that value. So it's really important to know that. So I think that covers most of those questions. But now we can maybe turn towards the last slide here, the pre-prepared questions
Yeah, for
that
sure.
we had.
No.
So maybe, Johan, you can take this one. How can I avoid steel and aluminum tariffs if possible? And will there be country-based exemptions or tariff rate quotas that return? What's your perspective on that, Johan? And do you think we'll see any give in these steel and aluminum tariffs?
What we're hearing out of Washington right now is that no one is willing to take the discussion with the administration about exemptions. It's been such a hardline approach from the Trump administration on the steel and aluminum exemptions and tearing all of that up. So for now, it seems unlikely. Over time, I'm sure there are qualities that don't exist and processes that don't exist that they may consider exemptions for. But at the same time, the entire idea around a lot of this is to bring back manufacturing into the US. So unlikely that we'll see exemptions, but it's hard to guess where this administration is going to go on exemptions to steel and aluminum, but I'd say unlikely.
Thanks for giving the perspective on that. And just for the sake of time, I'll turn to another kind of category of questions. So we're receiving some about the de minimis, and I think we had an example question here around the de minimis import exemption. This is only on products of China or Hong Kong that are no longer allowed to receive that de minimis exception. So it's good to know that. I see we have a question. Will the one for Europe still be active for at least 2025? I'd like to say yes, but with the great things happens under this administration, we'll see if that changes. But for now, it's just Chinese and Hong Kong products. And our perspective and what we've been hearing is that it plans to just stay for those countries. The main goal of removing this de minimis exemption is to target those, especially fast fashion importers and e-commerce importers that are just taking advantage and massive amounts of shipments coming in, to the US on the daily. So they're really kind of abusing this system. So for a small Swedish e-commerce enterprise that may be purchasing one of their products from China and then, adding a margin on it and selling it to the, customers in the US, we don't think these are the targets necessarily, but they are trying to curb the massive amount of these small shipments that are coming in from China directly. There's also a way to kind of, at least if you are one of those e-commerce companies that does have products coming from China to the US, there's a way to at least mitigate some of the impact of these tariffs, and it's called first sale of export. We have some more resources we can share on this method, but it lets you use the value that you pay to the manufacturer. So that first sale, so when the manufacturer sells it to you, it lets you use that value for the tariff rate, or for the tariffable value. So instead of the value you charge to your customer. However, there's a caveat for this method. It needs to be shipped directly from China to the US. Typically, that's from our understanding. It's better to talk to a customs broker. Maybe there's a way you can kind of prove that. It's a little bit harder to prove if you're stopping over in a Swedish warehouse, because then they can say, well, you didn't actually know it was coming to the US. You just stored it in your warehouse until you got a sale here, and then you shipped it to the US. So it's a little bit harder. You need that documentation to kind of provide that proof that it was always intended for the US, but it lets you reduce that value that you're being tariffed on. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. And we are at time, so let's wrap up here. I know we have more questions. So how can Team Sweden assist? Maybe Helena and Johan, you can take this. How can the trade and invest facilitation team support? How can our other partners at the embassy, at Commerce Collegium, and the Business Sweden USA support companies, and what questions? Who should they go to for what? Yeah, I'll end there.
I had the one question that I would like to just, if you could just take a quick sentence about it, and it's about this rumors, or how to say, about the service fee for the Chinese vessel coming into the US ports. Do you have anything, small sentence about that?
Yes, and so from what we see, that there will be no additional fees on those Chinese vessels, at least until October 14th was the timeline I believe we saw. So if you have more questions about that, we're happy to dive deeper, but the timeline seems to be a little bit more extended on that.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. This presentation will be sent out to whom of you that have been listening in today. We will send some valuable links that we have talked about and presented today. And we will also have this webinar recorded, and I think we will have it in the US blog that you have. I think our Marcom wanted to put it there, so I hope so, but we will let you know. So from me, thank you very much for you that have listening today, and thank you very much for Johan and Jacob for being a part of this webinar with me today. And I wish you all a pleasant day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.